welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center to our session this morning. We're delighted to have Patrick Chovanec directly from Beijing. He teaches at the Tsinghua School of Economics and Business. He's a frequent commentator on both Western and Chinese media on the Chinese scene, primarily economics and financial matters, but he ranges quite broadly. He has a background in finance and on the political side, and familiar with Washington. When he was here a few years ago, among his other responsibilities, he was an aide to now Speaker John Boehner. So he's got a broad view. I would commend to you his blog on WordPress. It's a very interesting collection, and he keeps up on comments on many aspects of events in China. This morning he'll talk on the Beijing consensus, fact or fallacy. After his remarks, we can break into open discussion. So with that, Patrick, it's over to you.
Good morning. Thank you very much for that introduction. It is a pleasure to be here, and I'd like to thank the Wilson Center for hosting me. It's very good to see you all. You know, when I first came to China, I was still in high school in the 1980s, in 1986, and even into the 1990s when I came back and traveled around. Frequently conversations would open like this. They'd say, "Where are you from?" I'd say, "I'm from America." And they'd say, "Oh, America is a very rich country. China's a poor country, not so good." And you feel kind of bad when people say that. So I'd say, no, China's a good country. You know, a lot of things are happening here. I tell that story because about a year ago, I flew down to Guangxi and got in a taxi cab at the airport, and the taxi driver asked me, "Where are you from?" I said, "I'm from America." He said, "Oh, I hear you don't have any money in America anymore." I said, "Well, things are tough, but you know, we're still okay. We have some money." He said, "Oh, no, I hear you don't have any money. We have a lot of money here." So he wasn't actually interested in making me feel any better about the situation. I tell this story because it kind of relates in a very concrete way why we're here talking about the Beijing consensus, because obviously the U.S. economy has stumbled, the European economy has stumbled, and China's economy has hummed along and done, it's been really the bright spot in the world, and people look to it and wonder, what is it? What's the secret sauce that makes China so successful? And some people have proposed that there is a unique China model or Beijing consensus. The reason why they use the word Beijing consensus is in contrast to what was called the Washington consensus. Now, the Washington consensus meant a lot of things to a lot of people, but broadly speaking, it was that in the wake of the end of the Cold War, that there was a general consensus that to develop, countries needed to open their economies. There was a belief in free trade, free flows of capital, and it was symbolized by organizations like WTO, or GATT, which transformed itself into WTO, and in broader membership in those organizations, including China's own accession to the WTO. Obviously, in the wake of the global financial crisis, a lot of the assumptions that people felt, particularly free flows of capital and financial liberalization, that people felt were core to the Washington consensus, have been certainly called into question, if not many people feel discredited. And so people are looking for an alternative, and particularly, why has China been so successful? The term Beijing consensus has probably been around for a while, but it was introduced into the current discourse by Joshua Cooper Ramo in an article that he wrote in 2004, and he proposed 3 elements to the Beijing consensus. First of all, an emphasis on improvisation or flexibility, as opposed to the dogmas that were viewed as dominating the Washington consensus of always having open markets, always having free trade, always having free flows of capital. That instead that China would follow the suggestion of Deng Xiaoping of crossing the river by feeling the stones. So, and you know, he also said it doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white as long as it catches mice. So, moving away from sort of an ideological focus or a world-based policy recommendations based upon theory, and more just implementation based upon practice, what works. So that's number one. Secondly, an absence of a focus exclusively on GDP, and in particular GDP per capita as a measure of development, that there would be other things that should be measured, including the development of key industries or the distribution of wealth, the sustainability of development. So GDP alone should not be the measure. And then third, an emphasis on self-determination. That is, perhaps you could see that as a reaction to IMF austerity measures, but there certainly is a view that the Washington consensus, when applied to countries in crisis, did not always take into account their particular conditions, and sometimes got it wrong, and sometimes caused them to do things which by the book might have made sense, but in terms of their political dynamics, in terms of their social dynamics, actually got them into trouble. And so Beijing, which is always focused on its independence, its sovereignty, would chart its own path. Now, what's interesting about these is that they're, in many ways, negative definitions of the Beijing consensus. It's what the Beijing consensus is not. It's not the Washington consensus. It dissents from the Washington consensus. But I think that that's a good starting point to understand what it might be. But clearly, there's a point at which, especially if Beijing or China becomes a rising or even dominant power, and many people expect that at some point, if current trends persist, that China will become the largest economy in the world. There's a lot of talk about when China rules the world. And what will this mean? What will this mean concretely in terms of a development model? What are the positive recommendations? Now, Ramo was defining it in a negative sense on purpose, and it's very clear from his article that he meant to do that, and that he thought it was actually a mistake to try to define it positively. But I do think inevitably that we have to ask the question: if you cross the river by feeling the stones, what stones did you feel on the way across, and what are the lessons both for other countries, but also for China going forward? And there is some desire to know, well, what does China's success bode for the rest of the world, and what does it mean, and are there lessons that can be drawn from it? And I think certainly that's true in China. People are asking, okay, what have we got here? What is the model? What is the consensus, if you will, going forward? What kind of economy do we have? What kind of state do we have? How has that succeeded? How has it failed? And you do have people engaging in a more substantive discussion, certainly in China, about what is the Beijing consensus in a positive sense. What are the recommendations? What are the recommendations, if not for the rest of the world, at least for China going forward? There was a very interesting article that I saw in the New York Times in this January, coming out of the Davos meeting, where someone from the New York Times talked to an unnamed Chinese economist or Chinese official, and asked, so what do you think? What do you consider to be the key components of the Beijing Consensus. And he said 4 things. And I think it's worth reading them verbatim from this article because they're quite meaningful, and I'll talk about them and kind of try to assess them near the end of my talk. The first is policy toolkit. The Chinese authorities have, and I'm reading from the article here, the Chinese authorities have a much larger toolkit to interfere in the economy, he said. They can regulate and tax and hand out contracts like in the West, but they also can and don't hesitate to meddle in financial markets if they feel a share price, for example, is not at the right level. Number 2 is corporate allegiance. Many companies are not only state-owned but accountable to the government as well. The government picks the management and managers report to the government. They are motivated less by pay than their Western counterparts, mainly because they are paid less. Even the boss of ICBC, the world's biggest bank by some measures, reportedly earns less than $200,000 a year. Resources. Number 3. Beijing controls unusually large resources. They have not just nearly $3 trillion in currency reserves and get a steady stream of profits from state-owned businesses, but they also control all the land. Fiscal problems do not exist in China, the economist said. If the authorities need money, they can just sell some land. And the 4th, long-term planning. The authorities in Beijing set long-term strategic priorities and then systematically pursue them in 5-year plans. And that last one is one that has gotten the attention of a lot of people in the West, particularly because of the frustrations that are felt in a multi-party, 2-party system in trying to come up with some kind of consensus about moving forward. And you've seen it reflected in op-eds like Thomas Friedman's, several op-eds that he's written in which he talks about why is it so hard for the United States to get it together. The Chinese have these very ambitious 5-year plan and beyond, in which enables them to make forward-looking investments and in the end make an end run around the West. So these are the 4 things that he laid out, that this unnamed official laid out, as defining the consensus. And I think they resonated with me as reflecting what I hear when I talk to people in Beijing. I don't think it's crystallized yet. I don't think that there's a clear view that this is the philosophy that will guide China going forward. But these are definitely the things that are topics for discussion and topics for a certain amount of pride. And in order to assess them, I think it's best to step back and try to understand, well, where is the Chinese economy? What has happened over the past couple of years, at least as far as I can see it? And I want to stress at the very outset that this is a story that I'm relating. This is how I see it. I'm not Moses. I don't want to frame myself as Moses coming down with the tablets and telling you, well, this is the way things are, because I'm going to say some critical things about the Beijing Consensus. And I throw them out as concerns, things that I don't necessarily have the complete answer to, but they are very real concerns to me. And I think that they raise concerns about the Beijing Consensus as a whole, and particularly the issues, the 4 points that define it, and as well about the 3 points that Ramo defined. So going forward, I want to strike at least a little bit of note of humility, because obviously China continues to grow, and people continue to look at it as a success story. But I do think that there's a story with some. I don't think this story is ended yet, and I think that there are some very real areas of concern and that need to be highlighted in China's economic story. China, for the past 30 years, has pursued an export-led growth strategy. This made a lot of sense. First of all, it was very successful for other countries, Japan, Singapore, South Korea, and it does make a lot of sense, because if you are a relatively poor country, instead of trying to wall yourself off from the rest of the world and have an import substitution strategy where you rely on the relatively meager buying power of your own population to try to grow, best to turn your poverty into an advantage. The fact that there's low opportunity cost and therefore low wages in the economy, make that a competitive advantage and sell to people who can afford things. And that is what Japan did. That's what South Korea did. It's what Taiwan did. It's what Singapore did. And China has followed in that path. Now, the challenge, of course, is that once the imbalances that are implicit in that model become a problem when they're not a problem when you're a small emerging economy. They are a problem when you become the second largest economy in the world, the largest exporter in the world. It becomes very difficult, as Japan found out in the 1980s, for your buyers to afford what you're making. And you end up accumulating IOUs in the form of reserves without any end in sight. And essentially this means that you're not getting the full value of what you're selling. You are selling not for part of what you're selling goes to improving your living standards, but a great deal of it ends up simply accumulating in IOUs that you give to your customers to enable them to continue to afford what you make. And this is not a sustainable situation. It's not a good situation for the country that is developing. But it's a very difficult transition to make. Most people agree that at this point a country, particularly China in this instance, needs to transition from export-led growth to domestic consumption-led growth. Japan tried to do that in the 1980s, but because in many ways the model that had succeeded for so long became so entrenched, it was very difficult for them to make that adjustment. And they ran into a great deal of trouble as a result of their unwillingness to make that. It's not simply a willful unwillingness to make that adjustment. I mean, I think we all know from just human experience, our own experiences, that we tend to learn more from our failures than our successes, and our successes often lead us down paths that end up not, that we fail to adapt. And so success creates its own obstacles, its own challenges, and this is what Japan experienced, and this is what China is experiencing now. Now, the thing that really woke China up to the need to make this transition was the global financial crisis and the fact that exports to the United States, to Europe, fell off a cliff at the end of 2008. There was a real sense of exposure to the global economy, and there was this sense of, well, we need to transition to a growth that we're not so exposed to supply demand shocks from the rest of the world. But I think it was conceived initially as, well, Chinese company will lose foreign customer, gain Chinese customer, and growth will simply continue. And there will be little turmoil, and that will be the transition. And of course, it hasn't worked out that way. The process of transition has been much more difficult than that kind of vision suggests. In large part because, not only because of the challenge of sparking, a lot of focus is on the demand side of the equations, and what can China do to spark consumer demand, but there's equal attention needs to be paid to the supply side of the equation. That is, this adjustment, which we talk about so easily, really involves a reorientation of the Chinese economy. Chinese exporters, by and large, are exporters. They are thoroughly embedded into global supply chains. They don't own their own brand. They don't own their own product. They don't have marketing or distribution in China. So for them to service a domestic-led economy, they need to develop significant new business skills. Some of them can succeed at that. I've seen some succeed. Others will fail. And when they fail, labor and capital will be reallocated to other parts of the economy in a process of creative destruction. New industries, new businesses will be created. But that is a very tumultuous process, and that is something that I think there's a very low comfort level with in China, certainly at the official level. So what happened instead of this transition? Because this transition really hasn't taken place. If you look at the most recent numbers, consumption as a percentage of GDP has actually been declining. There hasn't been a significant shift in the trade balance or China's accumulation of reserves. A lot of people look for signs that this is happening, but so far we haven't really seen much evidence that it has. So what has happened instead? How has China continued to grow? What has become the new growth driver? Well, you have to look at China's stimulus. China had a stimulus, very large stimulus. It didn't have a fiscal stimulus, which is what we mostly associate with. The government goes out and spends money, borrows money and spends money on its own. China had a monetary stimulus. It had basically, it allowed its banks, permitted its state-owned banks to lend very aggressively, lend very generously, very freely, to projects that would boost economic growth. And I should specify boost economic growth. What is being measured when we look at economic growth in this sense is just the sheer amount of investment that's going out, not the return on those investments. It doesn't measure whether those returns are good or bad. It doesn't measure whether the investments are good or bad. We tend to think of economic growth, GDP growth, in a positive light. But really, investment growth, investment-led growth, can be either a blessing or a curse depending on how that money is invested and whether it's invested in good things or bad things. But what we saw in China was a lending boom that led to an investment boom. The lending boom over 2009, 2010, the total loan portfolio in China expanded by 58%. So a huge amount of capital went out. And there was a huge investment boom. Now, and in 2009, 90% of GDP growth was due to investment in fixed assets, of net GDP growth, I should say, because there was a negative contribution from exports. In a more normal year where the contribution from exports was positive in 2010, investment in fixed assets still accounted for well over half of GDP growth, of gross GDP growth in this case. So investment became the driver, replaced exports as the key driver of economic growth. Consumption declined as a percentage of GDP. It grew, but it declined as an overall percentage because of the expansion of investment. This boom, this lending boom, this stimulus raises two questions. First, where did the money go? And second, where did it come from? The issue of where did the money go is the question of bad debt. Are these good investments? Are these bad investments? Will they end up being paid back or not? I've traveled around China a great deal. I can say that I think that there's a mixed bag. I think that some of these investments made a great deal of sense, but that was not really the criteria. The criteria was to shovel money out the door to boost GDP. And that a lot of things that probably didn't make sense or didn't make sense in the time frame that they were developed, because a lot of these were originally envisioned as 10 to 20-year phase projects, and they were accelerated into 2 to 3 year projects, probably don't make sense. And increasingly, we see evidence that bad debts will come home to roost. And we see it coming even from the government and the government's own study and the talk about the need to bail out the banks and the fact that China really for the last year has been focused on recapitalizing its banks. Why? Because they know that a wave of bad debt is coming, and they know that the banks need to be shored up. And I can go into more detail if you have questions about the bad debt issue. But what I would say is that the danger down the road of this bad debt concern is not that there will be a credit crisis in China. You have a state-owned banking system. As one of the points indicated, they take their orders from the government. Agricultural Bank of China is not going to suddenly stop lending overnight to ICBC because they're afraid of what's in their lending portfolio. Even if there are losses, they will continue to lend, and those banks will not run into a liquidity crisis, and there won't be a credit contraction. But what you may have is more of a Japan-style situation where, remember, from the peak of the bubble, when the bubble peaked or popped in the winter of 1989, it took almost 10 years for Japanese banks to actually recognize the bad debt that was on their balance sheets. They pushed good money after bad, they rolled over loans, they pushed things off balance sheet. But that had a cost economically. It may not have been obvious what that cost was, but there was a cost. And one of the main costs was the inability of the banks to function as banks to reignite growth, that they were too busy trying to cope with the mess that had been created to really function as funders of new economic growth. But a lot of attention has been paid to this side of the equation, the bad debt side. Where did the money go to? The side that hasn't gotten as much attention is, where did the money come from? The money came from an expansion of the money supply. China's money supply expanded by over 50% over the past 2 years. That's a pretty staggering increase in the money supply. How did this happen? It happened because for many years, China has been running trade surpluses and also has been importing capital on the capital account, so it's been a net importer of capital. And that means that it's a net importer of currency. Now, normally when you're a net importer of currency, you're holding all this foreign currency that you don't really need or want. Your home currency will appreciate in value. But, of course, China has a peg that it maintains, and the central bank, the PBOC, intervenes, buys those excess dollars, accumulates them in reserves, and in return issues renminbi. Now, this adds to the domestic money supply. Normally, this would cause inflation. But in order to prevent inflation, not just China, but other countries often engage in what's called sterilization. That is, they take that money that they just put into the domestic money supply and they take it back out again, and they freeze it in the banking system in the form of reserves or bond holdings. So there's this frozen pool of liquidity in the banking system that is available, potentially available, but has been removed from the economy in order to prevent inflation. What happened in at the end of 2008, throughout 2009, and continuing through 2010 was not only did Chinese banks draw down on this pool of reserves, this pool of liquidity, so they de-sterilized. They took this money and they lent it out and injected it back into the economy. But for about 2 years running, until around November of last year, they were not sterilizing because they were making even more foreign exchange purchases to maintain the peg and the renminbi, about 1.5 trillion worth. And that money, instead of being frozen up, was going directly into the economy and adding to the base, the deposit base that banks could use to lend. And so that's where you got this explosion in lending. That's where you got the financing for this investment-led growth was from a large expansion of the money supply. Now, when you have a 50% expansion of the money supply, the question that comes to mind is not why is there inflation, it's why isn't there hyperinflation? Why aren't we seeing more inflation sooner? I think the answer to that question is you follow the money that was created. That money primarily went into an investment boom, not a consumption boom. So it went to companies that bid up the price of land, that bid up the price of raw materials. We've heard about copper stockpiling in China and the effect that Chinese demand for commodities has had on commodity prices globally. When it ended up in people's pockets, they tended to put it in tangible forms of savings like real estate, gold, jade, tea, wine, antiques, art, many different things that have shot up in price well above anything that we've seen in the consumer price index. I saw a number recently. It's kind of hard to judge these things, but I saw a number that said over the past 2 years that basically property prices in China have doubled. Certainly that corresponds with my own experience. And so you had asset inflation. Asset inflation is a funny thing, though, because asset inflation doesn't feel like inflation. It feels like a boom. Asset inflation, when the price of bread doubles, it feels like it's getting harder to make ends meet. When the price of high-end condominiums doubles, it feels like smart investors are getting rich. So it doesn't feel like inflation. But eventually, if that is in fact due to inflation and not simply rising real demand, then that will flow over into the general price level. And that's why about 1.5 years ago I started writing about inflation. When inflation stood at about 2%, I started saying you're going to see a run-up, a sustained run-up, not just a spike because of weather or things like that, but a sustained run-up in inflation in China because there's just more money chasing the same amount of goods or only slightly more amount of goods. And I think we've seen that. We haven't, obviously the official figures say it's about 5.6% inflation. That's well above where the government wanted it to be at around 3%. Now the target's around 4%. It doesn't, there's talk that maybe it will come down in the summer, but I just don't see what is changing. Now, China, because I don't think that the view that I'm expressing here is any different from what, if they were being forthright about it, the central bank, the PBOC, would say. They have clearly hinted that they see inflation in China as a monetary phenomenon, and that they want to not only use tightening tools, raising the required reserve ratio, raising interest rates, but also allow the renminbi to appreciate, because allowing the renminbi to appreciate would remove the need that they have to constantly be buying dollars, issuing renminbi, and injecting more and more renminbi into the money supply. A lot of the tightening measures that we've seen over the past several months are not actually tightening. They are simply running to stay in place. They're just counteracting the expansionary policy that China has to run to maintain the peg. So they want to get out from under that and actually have the freedom to have a monetary policy that can get inflation under control. The challenge here, though, is that, well, in the immediate run, the challenge is that how to avoid a hard landing. Because, like I said, well, first of all, Premier Wen gets up in front of the National People's Congress in March and says, we're going to resolutely fight inflation, and we're going to have 8% GDP growth. Well, the problem with that is that over half of GDP growth is coming from investment in fixed assets, which is primarily credit-fueled. And it's not measuring the return on investments, it's simply measuring the amount of investment going out. So you have to continually fund that by an expanding money supply. The same policies that are fueling inflation are fueling over half of your GDP growth. And if you're serious about kicking the legs out from under inflation, you're going to kick the legs out from under about half your GDP growth, at least in the short run. Now, maybe that could actually be a good thing, because it would refocus growth on areas that are more sustainable. But certainly that would come as a shock. And I think the farther it is kicked down the road, the more of a shock it will be. The year for a soft landing was 2010. The year for a bumpy landing is 2011. And the year for a hard landing would be 2012 if this is kicked too far down the road. The greater concern down the road, though, is what does China need to do to sustain future growth, to get on a more sustainable growth path. And the longer that this model continues, the investment-led, credit-fueled growth model continues, the farther the day is that China can actually make the real transition that it needs to make, the difficult one, the painful one, but the critical one, from export-led growth to a healthy, sustainable, domestic, consumption-led economy. And it's easy to keep on avoiding that because it is painful. Or at least it has opportunities as well as pain, but the pain is certainly to be felt. And by pursuing this path, by running down what is essentially a blind alley, it actually makes the hurdle higher and higher. So, for instance, moving towards a convertible currency becomes very difficult because China, to have a convertible currency, China needs to open up the capital account allow people in China to invest abroad freely. To do that, then you need to deregulate interest rates, because if you don't do that, then you'll have hot money inflows coming in and out of the country. But to do that means that you no longer can you have a guaranteed spread for the banks that the banks are relying upon to, at least in part, earn their way out of the bad debt problems that they've gotten themselves into by all this policy lending, this lending that will not actually generate returns. The other thing that you need to do is create a more competitive environment for Chinese companies domestically, so that they're better prepared to compete abroad. A number of things that need to happen that won't happen as long as China continues to pursue this path. So that's a longer-term concern. And why is this even an issue? It's an issue because what allowed China to succeed over the past 30 years is not going to continue to allow it to succeed in the future. It's going to have to adapt. That isn't a sign, by the way, that China has failed. It's a sign that China has succeeded, but its very success has changed the game. So in the past, China had the advantage of cheap labor and relatively low-hanging fruit in terms of productivity gains. You took somebody from the farm, you put them in a factory. The returns were so phenomenal that, quite frankly, it didn't matter that you were wasting half your capital, because the returns on the capital that you were investing, that was productively invested, were so fantastic it completely outweighed the losses. It's kind of like a venture capital model where you invest in 10 companies. You know that 7 of them are going to fail, 2 of them are going to break even, and 1 of them is going to be Google, and it's going to outweigh all the money that you lost. Well, in some ways, China's economy was working like that, and I saw that up front as a private equity investor in China. That the range of companies, there were a lot of horrible companies out there, but the companies that were doing well were so phenomenal. The potential that they had was so phenomenal that it really was enough to transform the economy. This is not going to be the case going forward. I think the productivity gains are going to be much harder won. The opportunity costs reflected in wages are going to be higher. And that is going to place a premium on efficient use of capital, a banking system that allocates capital based upon return, not based upon simply boosting GDP growth for the moment because of it's simply tallying the amount of funds that are being sent out. So the reforms that are necessary to keep China on a path that I think it can pursue. I'm not bearish on China. I think that if China takes the steps that are necessary, it can succeed and continue to succeed and continue to grow. But right now, it's going down a blind alley in a way. So with this in mind, let me just walk through very quickly those points that were raised. First, Ramos's points, and then the 4 points that Chinese official in Davos raised. So Ramos's point, his first point was improvisation and flexibility. Okay, obviously improvisation has served China well in some ways, but this essentially what happened here was that a short-term fix, which was the stimulus, and I don't blame China in 2009 for simply throwing the kitchen sink at the problem, became, because of its apparent success, the new norm. And it was hard to move away. The improvisation seemed to succeed so well that it became the new model without recognizing the limitations of that improvisation. So improvisation is all very fine and good, but I do think it's important sometimes to have a vision about where you want your economy to go and the willingness to take hard steps to make that happen, and that requires vision. I wrote a piece a year ago when I was arguing that China now needed to move away from this stimulus model and needed to start making this adjustment back in 2010, where I think it was still, would have been less painful than it is now to make this transition. I said China needs a new Southern tour. The Southern tour refers to 1992, when after a period of retrenchment following the unrest in 1989, China really clamped down on its economy, and it was really an open question about whether China would continue to open to the rest of the world, whether they would continue to open the economy. Things were pretty much at a standstill. A lot of kind of state planning types were put in charge. And in 1992, Deng Xiaoping took a trip down to Shenzhen in which he said, no, this is fine, we've retrenched, but we have to open up. We have to take the risk. Yes, it is risky. Yes, it could cause disruption. We don't necessarily know what the end result is, but we have to go down this path because this is going to be the path that's going to make China a wealthier country. But there has to be that vision and that willingness to do that. And that is equally as important as any amount of improvisation or flexibility. Or not hewing to dogma on the one hand is a good thing, but also having vision is important as well. The second, the absence of a focus on GDP growth. Well, certainly you'll hear that. You'll hear that when they talk about the 5-year plan. The 5-year plan talks about moving away from a reliance on GDP growth to other measures. But the reality is, over the past 2 years, there has been no country so obsessed with GDP figures as China. Meeting 8% as a minimum is almost a religious belief, and it doesn't matter how you get there. Like I say, most of what's happening in GDP growth right now in China is simply pumping money out into the economy. It's not measuring whether this is going to be in the long term good or bad for the economy, or whether it's going to set China on a future growth path, or whether it's actually creating real wealth. It's simply people meeting their targets. So I would say that while in principle, in the 5-year plan, China has recognized the need to do that, in reality, in terms of the things that motivate local officials, the number one key to advancement is to come in with a very high GDP number, and usually just simply by building things and financing them through the kind of expansion that we've seen. And that is not a healthy thing. And so in some ways, China hasn't followed its own model in this respect. Self-determination. Self-determination is a good thing. But all too often, I think this idea of making a transition from export-led growth to domestic consumption-led growth is seen in China as a way of sort of disengaging from dependence on the rest of the world. That this is a way to sort of just internalize growth as opposed to being exposed to the global economy. In fact, real rebalancing won't just be sort of China cutting itself off from the rest of the world. It will actually be Chinese people drawing down on those reserves that they've earned to buy things and make investments around the world. It's going global. And in fact, China's dependence around the world will be even greater if it pursues the path that it really needs to pursue. Rebalancing is not, as it all too often is seen in China, sort of a plot concocted in Washington to try to rein in China's economic development. It's actually simply a reflection of the level of growth and development that China has achieved and its impact in the global economy. And it can be a very positive thing for people in China. It doesn't have to be a negative thing. But that requires a change in thinking, where for the past 30 years, the view has been exports good, imports bad, capital inflows good, capital outflows bad. Well, that made sense 30 years ago when China was desperate to get its hands on foreign currency. China's drowning in foreign currency today. And that mindset, not just the mindset, but the structure of motivations that drive people's behavior in China needs to evolve with its economy. Moving on to the specific points that were raised by that official. The policy toolkit, that they have a larger toolkit that they can meddle in markets and fix prices and do things like this. I mean, you see this reflected right now in the response to inflation. That the NDRC's response is to simply slap price controls on and say that we're going to squelch speculation and we're going to police prices and that this is going to solve the inflation problem. It's not, and it hasn't, because fundamentally this is being driven by more money chasing the same amount of goods. I think that the danger of a U.S. model is that you get corrections. You get severe corrections. And they have a lot of collateral damage, and they hurt people who didn't even make bad decisions because there's a credit contraction throughout the economy. We've lived through this. We've seen this. The danger in a Chinese model is that it's so insulated from these market forces that tend to buffet us. It's so insulated from that you don't get the correction. That prices can be ignored, that market signals can be ignored, and that you can continue to allocate resources in a direction that may or may not make sense. And I would argue that a recession will not destroy an economy. It can be very painful, but it can also be an opportunity for adjustment. But continued misallocation of resources will impoverish an economy if it's allowed to continue for too long. And that is the great danger in any system that is too insulated from corrections. Corporate allegiance, the fact that you've got this state-owned sector that can take orders from the government. There are two great tragedies here that have taken place over the past 2 years. The first is what's happened to the banking sector. The banking sector in China was making strides, not all the strides that people hoped, but significant strides towards becoming commercial entities that lent on the basis of return and could fulfill that function of efficient allocation of capital in a Chinese economy that's going to be essential for China to move forward. And then, in the course of being used to fund the stimulus, they went back to basically being a piggy bank. And you see that now with all the talk about affordable housing, which essentially means subsidized housing, because we're not talking about a market correction in housing. We're talking about subsidizing housing and using the banks to subsidize housing. And once again, they're going to be used to drive loss-making loans. And that I'm not as concerned about the damage that that's done to the balance sheet of banks as to the corporate culture, to the idea that they really were making strides in the direction of fulfilling the roles that banks need to play in an economy. The other great tragedy is what's called, in China, entrepreneurs refer to as guojin mintui, or the state advances, the private sector retreats. I don't think this was intentional, but as a function of the money that was pumped out that mainly went to state-owned enterprises, a bit of a protectiveness, which is natural during a time of economic uncertainty. The center of mass, or at least the feeling is that the center of mass has shifted from the private sector to the state sector, to a state sector that is now seen as you know, as this economist pointed out, playing a central role in what distinguishes the China model from everything else. And I think that's very unfortunate, because alongside of that has been a reinterpretation of the past 30 years. Now, politicians want to claim credit around the world, and it's totally understandable, but there's been a kind of revisionist history of the past 30 years that the Chinese economic model was essentially a series of 5-year plans in which, under the wise guidance of officials in Beijing, that in which entrepreneurs played their dutiful but subordinate role. And I can tell you certainly from what I saw over the past 25 years that I've been interacting with China that that was not at all what happened. That what happened was the government courageously and farsightedly stepped back and allowed people for the first time to create value, to improve their own lives, to create businesses, to innovate. And that innovation is alive and well in China. It exists, but it's being crowded out now in the view under the aegis of a model that doesn't really value it as it should be. And increasingly, I mean, you had it going out in the sense that the money that was lent out mainly went to the state sector and mainly fueled the growth of the state sector, but you have it coming in now where, because the tightening that's taking place in order to rein in inflation is falling most heavily on the private sector. State sector things are still getting funded, but it's the private sector that's really the most productive sector of the economy, the sector that's going to be most important for China to make this adjustment to more sustainable growth, that's really bearing the brunt of the cutoff in funds that's taking place as a consequence of inflation. So they get it coming and going. The third is resources. So China's got $3 trillion reserves. Very famously, Thomas Friedman says, never short a country with $3 trillion reserves. I think that's a fundamental misunderstanding of what the reserves are. That money is not a treasure chest that the Chinese government owns that it can simply allocate towards anything that it wants to. First of all, that money is already in the Chinese economy. It was purchased and then exchanged. Those dollars were purchased in exchange for renminbi. That renminbi is in the economy. Initially, it was frozen in the economy to avoid inflation. Then it was released into the economy. Those are the dollars that China's earned are claims on dollar-denominated goods and assets or investments. They ultimately have to make their way home. Now, the dollar is not just a national currency, it's a global currency, so what it can be used for is a little bit broader than what most currencies can be used for, but ultimately those are external claims. So China could buy a lot of goods, it can also invest abroad, it could even sustain significant capital flight. If people got nervous about the economy, you know, the truth is not never short a country with $3 trillion reserves, it's never short a currency with $3 trillion reserves, because China could sustain significant capital outflows without having to devalue its currency, unless it wanted to, which it might want to, but that's another story. So it's a resource that's available. It is available for purchases abroad of investments and goods. It is not available, really, for growth in China unless that's inflationary growth. And it is not held free and clear, so every dollar that the PBOC holds in its reserves is balanced with a liability on its balance sheet. So it simply can't give that money away to banks, for instance, to recapitalize them. It has gone through that mechanism in the past, but in a small way. But in the future, it really can't say, well, don't worry about the losses because it can all be made good with these reserves. The PBOC, or the government of China, doesn't hold those reserves free and clear. Those essentially borrowed from people in the Chinese economy. That money's already in the Chinese economy. So that's, I think, a real misconception. And this idea that fiscal problems don't exist because they can always sell land, I think is a little worrying in the sense that what it points to me is this notion that this asset inflation is embedded in the Chinese economy in the sense that they are wedded to boosting asset prices in order to fund losses that are hidden on these investments and assets. So it's a vicious cycle as opposed to a virtuous cycle. It's not something to take comfort in. It's something to worry about. And long-term planning. I'll finish just by talking about long-term planning. In a online forum of when this article first came out, I'm part of an online forum of Chinese scholars, and I responded to this by saying, I'm not so sure that I really see a lot of long-term planning taking place in the Chinese economy. And of course, I expected the roof to fall on my head, and it did, because it is a very contentious thing to say. But the reality is, I go around, I meet with local officials, I meet with local industry, and what I have to say is there's a lot of short-term behavior taking place in China under the guise of long-term planning. Of course they call it long-term planning because that's whatever gets you what you want. But the reality is most of the things that are being proposed for investment, I'll give you an example. So there's been this huge high-speed rail build-out in China. On top of that, the very ambitious 20,000-kilometer build-out that is already underway, provincial and local officials in China went to the central government and, not collectively, but individually, asked for an 80% increase in that program to build 80% more track. I can assure you that it is not on the merits of high-speed rail. It is because it helps them hit their GDP target. It helps them have employment. They don't have to pay for it, unlike a lot of the infrastructure projects, because the central government, the Ministry of Railroads, issues bonds. So it's perfect. Why not ask for it? A lot of what was driven out in terms of investment in China was due to the fact that it was very clear that you had to hit a minimum of 8% GDP growth, or your career was over. And better yet, do 9%, 10%, 12%, 15%. That's much more impressive. That will catch the eye of people. And the easiest way to do this was to build. So there is, I think, a lot of short-term planning taking place under the guise of long-term planning. And in contrast, it may seem like there's a lack of long-term planning taking place in a market economy, but in fact, there's a lot of long-term planning taking place. You go to any company in the United States, in Europe, or anywhere else, or in China, in the private sector, and they have a plan. They have a plan. They have a vision of what the future is going to be. They have an idea about how they're going to get there. Just that each one of them has a different plan, and they will compete to see which one is actually the most effective. Some of them will win, and some of them will lose. In China, there's one plan. And all too often, unfortunately, when I talk to Chinese entrepreneurs these days and I ask them, what is your strategy going forward, the first words out of their mouth are 5-year plan, which means that they're not thinking independently, they're not thinking out of the box all too often. I'm not saying they all are, but all too often there's a tendency to simply conform. And that leads to a lot of rent-seeking behavior as opposed to really innovative behavior, and the kind of innovative behavior that's going to be necessary to move China forward in the future. So I'll conclude with this. It sounds like I'm giving you a very, very sad, negative outlook on China. I'm not. Nothing that I have said here should indicate that China is doomed in any way, shape, or form. There is immense entrepreneurial energy in China. China has the challenges that China faces are challenges that are a product of its success, not its failure. They're good challenges to have. But I would submit that what has been described as the Beijing consensus, and by the way, I'm not so sure that there's a consensus. Wang Xishan came here for the Strategic and Economic Dialogue last month, and he wanted Charlie Rose. And one of the most interesting things he had to say was that there is not a consensus. I mean, the Chinese leadership is not unaware of all of the things that I've said. They're not unaware of the problems in the current model. They're finding it hard to get out of it, and also there is not a consensus about what it means, about what the solution is. And he said that. He said there's not a consensus, and that they're struggling with this. And that's why I think you see the nervousness in China, whereas, you know, the impression is that, well, China is just moving forward like a juggernaut. But there's a lot of nervousness in China because of an awareness of these problems, of the inflation problem, of the bad debt problem, of the innovation problem. So there's an awareness of these things, but I think that there needs to be a vision going forward, and I think that there needs to be, the thing I'm most concerned about is this reinterpretation of history, which sort of, on the basis of a notion of this China model that is so distinct and so different, and actually involves closed markets and involves command economy, because I think that China is running down a blind alley, and it's painting itself into a corner in terms of its policy options going forward, and the longer that it puts off the real embrace of the changes that are necessary, that the more difficult the transition will be. I have faith that that transition will happen because China is meeting this challenge at a point much earlier in its development cycle than, say, Japan did. And Japan could afford to drift. You know, it had already reached a very high level of standard of living. So Japan could actually, it was easier just to drift and coast than it was to really make changes. In China, I don't think China's going to have the luxury of doing that because there's still many, many people who haven't yet tasted the fruits of economic reform, although they've seen it and they're aware of it and they know it and they want it. And so there's going to be a lot more pressure to adapt and change. And so therefore, although that sounds like a very volatile situation, it's also one that makes me think that there's a lot more hope for adaptation and change, as long as China does not convince itself of its own dogma. You know, the Washington consensus may have been a dogma, but I think the Beijing consensus is also, although it's portrayed as being anti-dogma, I think it is a dogma that is just as dangerous and that China also needs to overcome. So thank you.
Well, Patrick, thank you very much. You've given us, me anyway, a great deal to think about. Let me ask the first question, if I might. The Beijing consensus, in contrast to the Washington consensus, there's been a lot of discussion of how much impact it has globally. That is, how much it is found to be attractive, particularly by other developing countries. I'd be interested in your assessment of how effective it has been among other countries, if you see that globally other countries are turning this way. And if so, if the kinds of things that you're suggesting, the bumps in the road that it's going to encounter, will detract from that attractiveness. That is, whether if it has had some currency, particularly in the wake of the financial crisis, might it well be the case that that currency will diminish somewhat in the future?
I would say that it's important to distinguish between China's development story versus what I portrayed as the Beijing consensus or the China model. The first is actually quite dynamic. China's development story, I think, for a lot of countries has a lot of appeal and should have a lot of appeal. And it's important to understand it in a dynamic sense in which it was a moving, an opening of the economy in a, not in a big bang way, but in a thoughtful way and a step-by-step way that, and with some experiments along the way to see whether things would work. So a very judicious kind of opening. I think that still has and should have a lot of appeal. But I do know that I've been approached by people from other countries in the region who have said, you know, we're looking at the way that China does things and the way that it's been able to weather the storm of the economic crisis. And we're asking ourselves, should we have state-run companies? Should we have, or should we emphasize the private sector? And because this seems to work, you know, and having or should we have a state-led banking system, state-run banking system, as opposed to trying to develop with, for instance, the IFC or the World Bank engage in projects to develop a private banking system? What should we do? Because obviously we look around and we see that private banking systems can blow up sometimes, and China seems to have done so well. So I do think that there are countries that are asking themselves that question. And yes, of course, if China does run into difficulty, I mean, look what happened, you know, with Japan. I don't want to paint, by the way, that China is exactly the same as Japan, because there's many differences. But certainly we went through a process where everyone in the world was looking to Japan as the economic model, and that doesn't mean that there weren't really good lessons to be learned about quality improvement and things like that were very valid. But there was so much hype that surrounded particularly Japan at the peak of its bubble, and then of course now nobody's looking at Japan and saying, oh, we should do things the Japanese way, and maybe they shouldn't. Maybe they're painting things with too broad of a brush in a negative way, just like they were painting with too broad of a brush in a positive way. I also think that the attractiveness of the China model for a lot of countries, particularly, for instance, in Africa, is not so much actually emulating China as simply what China's participation in its economy can be. And for a lot of that, for many of them, I don't actually think that they're that exposed to the China model in the sense that China is going in and it's building hard assets in a country, and then it's financing it itself. So if there's money to be lost, if these are not sensible investments, the Chinese will lose their money, and then you know, Zambia or whoever else is going to still have the road, and they're still going to have the railroad, and so why not? Why not take the money? And in fact, I actually think that I've talked to a couple local officials here in the United States who are even thinking, you know, because there's that much money available for their infrastructure projects, they're thinking about why not ask the Chinese to build it and have them finance it. So you know, for some people, the appeal of the Chinese model is there's very little cost to it.
I'd welcome questions, comments from the audience. We have a microphone. If you'd wait for that, please. If you'd identify yourself and keep your questions brief. Yes.
In listing your 4 points from the New York Times.
Could you identify yourself?
Oh, James Sang, IBM retired. In listing your 4 points from the Davos article in the Times, in 3 of the cases you showed that the realities didn't match the words. You didn't talk about the 4th one, the second one, which was your accountability. One hears a lot about how the party appoints all the officials and the companies and the like, but one also occasionally hears a fair amount of stories about people, once they're wearing a particular hat, pushing back. And I was wondering if you could talk about how accountable and how much rebellion you see. Having spent 37 years at IBM, loyal officials, loyal VPs can often do funny things.
Yes. I think that there's a perception from afar that China is a authoritarian country, therefore what Beijing says goes. And of course, I think what Beijing says goes when there's a local incentive to do that. And then when there isn't, it's like herding cats. Whether those cats be the state-owned enterprises, whether those cats be local governments. So for instance, there was, in order to cool down the property sector, there was an instructive given out for all the state-owned enterprises, this is about a year ago, for all the state-owned enterprises that did not have real estate as their core purpose to get out of real estate investing, because there was hundreds of them have gone into it. That hasn't happened yet, because they just said, well, there's reasons why we can't really comply, and this, that, and they're still making real estate investments. You also see that with, to again refer to the real estate sector, the central government came out with a request for, or instructions for all cities in China to report back what the cap would be on real estate appreciation, price appreciation over this next year. And they all came back, and only one city, Beijing, said we will have no property appreciation. We will keep prices stable. All the rest said, well, GDP growth is going to be, 10, 12%. Okay, 12%. And I said, well, with negative interest rates, with money in the bank, because the inflation is higher than the deposit rate, 12% sounds pretty good to me. It sounds like a reason to invest in real estate, not to invest in real estate. And then one came back, I think one city in Gansu came back and said that their cap was going to be 50%. And they were just told to go back and come up with a better number. So but I was talking to somebody off camera, and I said, do you really believe that there's a single city in China that actually wants to rein in the real estate sector? No, of course they don't. I mean, not only is it GDP growth, it's all the same things I mentioned. It's GDP growth, it's employment, it's some money under the table. It's also 40% of the funding for local governments. So trying to get compliance now. The other side of that equation, though, is when the government said, go forth and lend to the banks, go forth and lend, don't worry about, we'll figure it all out later about whether they're good, but support economic growth. Chinese banks did that because they knew that they would not be held accountable for the losses, because they did, after all, they just did what the government told them to do. So who could blame them for that? And they also knew that it was to their advantage because they have this fixed spread between deposit rates and the minimum lending rate. So they're earning about 4%, and they see it as arbitrage because they're lending to primarily state-owned companies, and so they see that as zero risk. So get 4% for zero risk. The government clearly is going to cover your losses because they told you to do it. They were actually very happy to lend because it would put their assets to work. So there are times when accountability can be an issue, and there are times when accountability can obviously the accountability of officials can help get things done, but are they necessarily the right things? And I think all too often this is one of the reasons why it's so difficult right now, I think, to really have genuine tightening and to really rein in the money supply. Because if you are on the receiving end of the money stream that poured out over the past 2.5 years, and most SOEs or people who ran SOEs were, times were very good, and it was very good for you. And from your perspective, this is the way to run an economy. So there are a lot of entrenched interests when the PBOC says, look, the money supply is out of control, we really need to rein it in. There are a lot of people who, because they're not just companies, they're entities, they're government entities, are able to weigh in on the policy process and say, no, not so fast. These, don't raise our interest rates. That'll hurt our earnings. Don't rein in growth. We have all these very ambitious plans and that need to be funded, and that they're good for the economy because, after all, they'll boost GDP growth. And all the local officials say, yes, absolutely, it boost GDP growth. So there's this kind of confluence of interests which makes it very difficult for China to do anything other than kind of continue to pursue this.
Yes, right in the front.
Hi, this is Shiran from Institute for Policy Studies. If I remember correctly, there is a Chinese economist who teaches at Columbia University, and he has this theory about, say, like China's low consumption rate is attributable to like the skewed male to female sex ratio, because like there are more like families with like male children, and they want to make sure that their children are able to get married when they grow up, so they like save like crazy.
Right.
And if we are to say like transform the Chinese Chinese economic model to one that is export driven to one that is domestic demand driven, what are your suggestions? Do you really buy this economist theory? And what do you think like China should do?
Well, I think it's intriguing, and I think it may be truer of rural areas than it is true of urban areas. But I think it's interesting. I thought it was interesting enough to post on my website because it certainly attracted my attention. I think there are many other factors, of course, that lead to people saving a great deal. One is the healthcare system. That China has a system where presumably it's single payer. It's basically a defunded single payer program, where essentially you get free medical care from government insurance, but that will only cover the most basic of medicines, the most basic of treatments, and that anything that we would consider modern treatment, anything other than just standard antibiotics, is going to be out of pocket. And that even things that are covered by insurance, you're actually going to have to pay the doctors a tip, which is probably going to be at least as much as the actual fee, to do it, because they're underpaid. So a lot of people save for this. A lot of people save for the reality that they may have a big payout down the road, so they self-insure. One solution that China is embarking upon is to actually fund the healthcare system, but another solution would be to explore insurance options, because there is such a thing as health insurance in China, private health insurance, but it's not very widely available. But anyway, there are a number of different ways, public and private, in which you could explore figuring out ways. When I talk about a social safety net, by the way, China needs to develop a social safety net, but that doesn't prejudge what elements should be public and private, because there are elements that both can contribute to the equation. So healthcare is one major area. Unemployment is another. I often think that one of the main purposes of the stimulus money originally, the stimulus lending that went out, was actually they were working capital loans to shore up struggling exporters. That was in the first half of 2009. A lot of money went out to do that. And I always thought that, well, instead of doing that, why not use that money to fund an unemployment scheme and institute that, and then at least free up that labor so that it could shift into other areas of the economy away from the export sector, instead of just locking everybody up in the export sector and saying, we'll pay you to stand around and wait until exports pop up again. Better to fund a system that could lead to more labor flexibility. So labor flexibility is one thing, because you have people who, if they lose their job, they're out. They have no backup. There are a number of things that can be done on the demand side, but I think, and also the development of consumer credit. Not that that wouldn't be a very popular argument here, right? Because everybody's just gone through a consumer credit nightmare. But in China, people have cards. They walk around with cards. They use cards, but they're all debit cards, and they're not credit cards. So because there's very little, first of all, there's no system for checking people's creditworthiness, no reliable system. And also they have, one of the great hopes was that by opening up the financial system, that some foreign companies would come in with some expertise in these areas and JV with Chinese banks and help them develop this. I mean, right now, China does need, consumer credit would be a positive thing. Having the Chinese borrow a little bit to spend would actually be a positive thing. So, and it'd be a positive thing for the Chinese as well, because they would actually be realizing the value that they have created over the years, which has until now really only piled up in the form of IOUs to Americans to buy more stuff. So China has the exact opposite problem of the United States. There are things that could be done on the demand side, but there are also, I think, without a realization that this creates change and turmoil on the supply side and an acceptance of what that means. You can talk about demand side solutions, but they won't really change the equation, because look, people aren't going to move out of the export sector. Talk about there's pain or a need for pain. Well, it sounds awful to say that, but look, if you can make money exporting, why would you ever shift your capital somewhere else? Why would you shift it to a new enterprise serving underdeveloped market in China, or trying to develop a new market in China? And right now, the way that the financial system works is one of the critical things to develop consumer spending is the development of a service sector, which is extremely fragmented in China. And one of the big obstacles to that is Chinese banks lend on the basis of collateral, not on the basis of cash flow. So they don't really lend on the basis of return. They lend on the basis of how many assets you already have. So if you own a lot of property, or if you own a lot of heavy machinery, you will get loans, which means that capital flows to places where capital already is, as opposed to flowing to where capital is needed. And that can also help develop consumer spending in China, if that changed.
Excuse me. My name is Arnold Zeitlin, and I've been teaching in Guangzhou for the past 8 years or so. The present leadership has moved away from the Zhu Rongji emphasis on private sector, I mean, not emphasis, but giving greater weight. That leadership is now entering into a lame duck period, because next year there will be a change. How do you foresee that change having an effect on Chinese economic policy, if at all?
There's two answers. In the short run, it makes it very difficult to get anything done. There's a lot of the things that I've talked about are fairly recognized problems in China. They may not be openly discussed, but I think, if you went in and talked to the PBOC or the State Council or whatever, and they were really being forthright about this, they would see. They may not see the problems in the same way that I do, but they would see that there were challenges and that there needed to be a response. Right now, not only is there kind of a general lack of vision about the next stage for China, where China should be heading. I mean, there is some vision, and it's in the 5-year plan, but the 5-year plan doesn't really articulate a lot of detail. So, for instance, they say they want to move towards a more equitable tax system, but there's no discussion about what that means. And of course, that could mean 100 different things, right? Depending on what you think about what is an equitable or functional tax system. So that will all still remains to be fleshed out. And in the meantime, nobody has any political capital to spend on anything other than positioning themselves for 2012, the transition. And that will not, by the way, the early part of 2012, the late part of 2012. So for the next year at least, there will be a lot of jockeying about who gets what position. And all of those interests that I was talking about, those people who are on the receiving end of all of this lending, they are members of the Central Committee. They are, they are key decision makers in this process. And so You don't want to at least offend them, right? You want to at least seem amenable to their interests. In fact, the only thing that could really derail Xi Jinping or Li Keqiang would be to take a big stand on something and make enemies, right? So they're on a road to succeeding, and they just kind of want all the waters to be calm. So in the short run, it creates a paralysis. In the long term, we just don't know. So in America and in Europe, political leaders get where they are by defining themselves on at least some issues. Now, they might want to duck others, but they have to at least define themselves on some issues because they have to develop constituencies, and they have to mobilize those constituencies, and they have to get votes. In China, the way that you become a successful leader is by working behind the scenes with your peers, with your colleagues, to broker arrangements and deals and establish a consensus, and which is actually one of the reasons why Chinese officials tend not to be very good public speakers, because it's not necessary, to get to the top. Some of them are, but a lot of them, it's not. That's not why they got there. They got there because they're great consensus builders behind the scenes. But building consensus means, to some degree, trying at least until the last moment to appear to be all things to all people in order to bring them together. And that places an emphasis on ambiguity, kind of constructive ambiguity. But what that means, of course, is that you don't show your cards. And so there are some people who read the tea leaves and say, oh, maybe Xi Jinping is a reformer, or maybe he's not, or he went to Chongqing and he praised the red songs that Bo Xilai was singing, and what's he all about? And the truth is we don't know, and we don't know what Li Keqiang's view is. We don't even, quite frankly, really even know what who or when think about a lot of these things. Premier Wen will get up and sometimes he'll sing a song about the importance of market reform, and other times he'll talk about how it's great that they have these tools that market economies don't have. So it's hard to say exactly what goes on behind closed doors and who takes what arguments, because that's not presented to the public. So I wish that we could say, wow, we really knew what camp Xi or Li was coming from, and therefore what their vision was going to be for the future, but we just don't.
Well, let's take one in the back. Yeah.
Thank you for your speech first. Clement Dyke, American Council on Renewable Energy. You mentioned that China is going to transition away from being an exporter in the future. So do you see in the near future China is actually going to increase the investment towards, instead of exporting products, are they going to increase the investment, direct investment into other countries such as United States? On the other hand, as Chinese government is going to help out its local domestic companies to more focusing on domestic market, is it possible for Chinese officials to say no, to close up its doors to foreign investment and exporters in the future? Thank you.
Well, the key to all of this is two accounts that account for the balance of payments. The current account, which is basically trade primarily in goods and services. There are some other things that go into it, but primarily we're talking about the trade and service, the good and service trade balance. And then the second is the capital account, which is flows of investments. Generally, they have to balance each other out. So if you run a surplus in one, you have to run a deficit in the other, or else your currency will adjust until you do. Now, of course, you can intervene and accumulate reserves, or you can draw down on your reserves to keep your currency stable in the face of an imbalance, but ultimately, there are constraints on both sides of your ability to do that. So I was watching Phoenix TV. This was some time ago when the currency debate was in full flower. And there was a woman who is a very vigorous, Phoenix TV, for those of you who are not familiar, it's out of Hong Kong, I believe, and although they're now going to be based in Beijing, and it's a cable, no, it's a satellite. It's a satellite network that is allowed to be beamed into at least some homes in China, and very popular programming, more kind of Western style programming than on state TV in China. So there was a woman who said, she got up and she said, when Britain was industrializing, it ran a trade surplus. When the United States was industrializing, it ran a trade surplus. So why can't we run a trade surplus while we're industrializing? And my wife turned to me and she said, yeah, why not? And I said, well, because in each of those cases, very soon after they started running trade surpluses with the rest of the world, they started running capital account deficits. That is, they exported capital. So they took the money that they earned and then they then invested it in the rest of the world. So they weren't just accumulating it, which would have been inflationary. So if China can continue to be a net exporter if it turns around and takes those earnings and invests them abroad. Now they do, by default, invest them abroad. They invest them in treasuries. Okay, but that's not really what I mean. Invest them more productively abroad. Over the past several years, China has wanted to do that, and therefore they created things like CIC, China Investment Corporation, to make investments that were not just in treasuries. But the problem that they found was, if they wanted to do it all in a centralized way, under the aegis of the government, that they couldn't shovel it out as fast as they were earning it. You know, that they were really going to intelligently invest it, that it took time to do that, and in the time that it took for them to invest $20 billion, they earned $40 billion. So that was not really a solution. I think ultimately the solution is to open up the capital account and allow people in China to invest abroad. Now, the other solution could be, so people have a choice. So they could invest abroad, or they could also buy products from abroad as well. And that's where I think I think it's not a conscious misunderstanding. I just think it's a mistaken way of looking at things in China, that moving from an export-led growth model to a domestic consumption-led growth model means more self-sufficiency. Basically, it just means, well, we'll have our own demand and we'll satisfy our own demand, and then the rest of the world can go take care of itself. Whereas, in fact, what it really should mean is actually a change in net exports. That an increase in it doesn't have to be a decrease in the amount of exports, by the way, but an increase in the amount of imports. Which, again, you say that in China, and it sounds like you're arguing. The view in China is that somehow is stealing economic growth. That is consumer demand, which should be directed to Chinese companies, is actually being directed abroad. I just think that's a very short-sighted way of looking at it. And in fact, what it really is people having more of a motivation to produce because they're actually able to realize that value instead of lending it back out to Americans to live high on the hog. The Chinese economy right now, there's this notion it's got to grow at 8%, it's got to grow at 10% in order to improve living standards. But that's only because half of the rewards of what is produced are just going into the reserves. I mean, if you were actually able to realize that value in terms of buying power and living standards, then you could have slower growth and yet still have people's lives improving. And that would actually be a much more sustainable model for growth, because if China continues growing at 10% a year, I mean, forget about the impact on the reserves. Just the impact on commodity markets around the world is just not enough to feed that. So the challenge for China is to find a way, one way or the other, either through re-exporting the capital that it earns, or through using that to improve living standards to achieve a more sustainable path to not just growth, but just a better life, which is really the purpose of growth.
I think we've reached the bewitching hour. Please join me in thanking Patrick for a terrific presentation.